Hi everybody, Levi Clay here, and today I'm going to bring you my new series, Metal School. This is an incredibly simple concept. We're going to look back through the annals of rock history and take a classic rock or metal album, and I'm going to talk to you about it from a history perspective. We're going to learn who was involved, who the players were, what the story was, and of course, where this album fits in the evolution of our genre. So if you do enjoy this series, please do let me know in that comment section below if there are any albums that you think it would be fun to learn a little bit more about. As the title suggests, today we are going to be looking at Ozzy Osbourne's debut solo album, Blizzard of Ozz. It's an absolutely awesome album, one of my favourite rock albums of all time, hugely influential on me as a child. And of course, as we're talking about influential albums, the chances are they've probably been influential on a few other people. So what I would love to do with these videos is have some of my friends here on YouTube contribute little segments on why these albums were so important to them. So why don't we kick things off with Mr. Troy Grady.
1980, if you're a Brit, and 1981, if you're an American, was the year that Ozzy Osbourne went from your parents' record collection to your record collection. This is, of course, Blizzard of Ozz, the album that launched the solo career that would become one of the most prolific and influential in heavy metal. It also introduced to the world one of the pivotal figures in rock guitar, and of course, that's the incredible Randy Rhoads.
Whoa, Troy. Let me stop you there a second, man. You can talk about Randy Rhoads in a second, but you cannot talk about Ozzy's first album without really setting the scene and explaining how big Black Sabbath were. So on the 70s rock scene, there were few bands as big as Black Sabbath. And this makes sense, right? Because in the early 70s, they had a string of massively popular albums. Their debut album, Black Sabbath, moving on to, of course, Paranoid, and then Master of Reality, Volume 4, and then Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. There's a reason we look back and think of them as being one of the pioneers of heavy metal. They really were massively popular during the time. They were at the peak of their careers, the kings of the world. No gig was too big for this band. But of course, with with that level of success comes a certain degree of excess. And yeah, the drugs and the booze did flow. And with that, what tends to happen is interpersonal relationships break down. Now, Ozzy Osbourne, the lead singer of Black Sabbath, and Tony Iommi would butt heads many times over their careers together, but things were really starting to get frayed. And as we moved to the end of the 70s, the band was starting to sound a little bit tired. In fact, Ozzy even took a brief period away from the band so he could go and form a solo career, but after a few months actually decided that he would rather go back to Black Sabbath. And being the rock star that he was, he decided this right before the band were about to start recording with their new singer. But it was okay. They took him back. And in 1978, the band put out the album Never Say Die. Now, I'll be honest, I don't think it's one of Black Sabbath's best albums. It continued with that idea of the band sounding very tired, and there are lots of stories of drama happening during the recording sessions. And I can't imagine why things weren't really working for them. Maybe it's because Tony said things like this.
We were getting really drugged out, doing a lot of dope. We'd go down to the sessions and have to pack up because we were too stoned. We'd have to stop. Nobody could get anything right. We were all over the place. Everybody's playing a different thing. We'd go back and sleep it off and just try again the next day.
Now, at this point in the late 70s, it didn't matter how great your old songs were. You needed to have something new and fresh when you went out on tour. And the new songs just didn't cut it. And unfortunately, when it came to playing live, the band just weren't cutting it either. Now, of course, it probably didn't help that when they went out on the Never Say Die tour, their opening act was some Californian band called, Van Halen? You might have heard of them. I would expect a Metal School video on one of their albums very soon. Imagine the stress of having to get on stage knowing that there are so many tensions in your band and you feel like you don't really want to be there. And Eddie Van Halen and David Lee Roth have just been on the stage. That can't have been easy. Now, of course, the group did want to continue, but ultimately Ozzy Osbourne was fired from Black Sabbath in April of 1979. And that was it. As far as Ozzy was concerned, he was done. From king of the world to a down and out with absolutely no prospect whatsoever. Here's where we take a little bit of a twist, though, because you cannot talk about the Blizzard of Ozz without mentioning the Wicked Witch of the West.
Hey guys, Chris Feener here. What can I say about Blizzard of Oz other than the fact that it's an absolutely bananas record? I still make a point to go back and listen to this album at least once a year, and it consistently blows my mind. The guitar playing is absolutely incredible. The compositions are incredible. Ozzy's vocal melodies remain fresh and exciting, even though they're just littered with, Ozzy sensibilities, which really make the music timeless. I actually heard Tribute first, which was recorded in 1981, the live album shortly after Blizzard was recorded in 1980. So my experience was a little bit different. But Blizzard of Oz is just littered with important tunes as far as the progression of heavy music. Crazy Train, Mr. Crowley, my personal favorite, Revelation, Mother Earth. An astounding composition from beginning to end, mind-boggling guitar playing, with a structure that was, completely groundbreaking for the time. A brilliant meld of classic rock with classical sensibilities all throughout the tune. I firmly believe that this tune, in and of itself, was responsible as a gateway for me into progressive metal. It just sparked an interest that I hadn't yet discovered as an incredibly young guitar player. So Blizzard of Oz is definitely one of the most important records in metal history, and if you haven't checked it out yet, do so.
So with nothing else left to live for, Ozzy locked himself away in the La Park Hotel in Los Angeles and set about having one last party before he would have to go back to England and sign on the dole. Now during this period, it's reported that he would only open the door for people delivering pizza, or drugs of course, or any unlucky hookers that would find where he was. And I say unlucky because it was also reported that Ozzy wasn't washing or looking after himself in any way, shape or form during this period. Also, classy move, Ozzy. Your wife was back home looking after your children. I appreciate you were having a rough time, but that's some shady behaviour. But things got shadier, of course. During this period, nobody believed in Ozzy, and I completely understand that. He'd had his shot at fame, if you like, and he'd blown it. The only person actually that had any hope left in him was a young Sharon Arden, the daughter of Don Arden, Black Sabbath's manager. Now, of course, we all know where this one ended up. Sharon turned up at Ozzy's door and essentially said to him, look, if you can pull yourself together, we want to give you a shot. We want to try and get a band together and see where things go. And Ozzy had to grab onto this opportunity with both hands. Now, of course, we're talking about a story that happened almost 40 years ago, so this is where things become a little bit difficult. There are multiple accounts of how things happened during this era, and often lots of conflicting accounts, even from people that were involved in the actual band. But what we're relatively certain on is that after auditioning a few guitar players, actually Ozzy was hellbent on signing Gary Moore up. He was under the impression that Gary was actually interested, though of course Gary had said multiple times over the years that he was merely humouring Ozzy and that he wasn't going to take a risk with someone like Ozzy Osbourne. What we do know is that Dana Strum, the bass player of the band Slaughter, would eventually introduce Ozzy to a young guitar player by the name of Randy Rhoads. Randy didn't actually want to audition for Ozzy. He was playing in the band Quiet Riot and he wasn't a fan of Black Sabbath's music, so it wasn't something that he was overly interested in the slightest. But on the insistence of Dana Strum, after Dana called multiple times and harassed Randy, Randy thought he'd go and give it a shot just to get his friend to shut up. Now this is one of those classic rock and roll stories with conflicting accounts. Randy turned up to a hotel room, plugged in his practice amp. Ozzy was mortified that this young, skinny, blonde chick had just walked into the room. Of course, he would have been drunk and high, I imagine. Randy began playing some warm-up exercises. No more than warm-up exercises, no riffs, nothing really happened. And Ozzy was immediately floored and offered him the gig. And apparently Randy was quite annoyed about the fact that Ozzy hadn't even really heard him play.
This being the early 80s, your two favorite guitarists were undoubtedly Eddie Van Halen and Randy Rhoads. The two icons were immediately placed in a kind of involuntary competition, like a cola wars of Coke versus Pepsi, except Eddie versus Randy, which wasn't entirely fair because A, they didn't ask for it, B, you could like them both, and C, they were stylistically pretty different. Whereas Eddie's wheelhouse was kind of a space-age turbocharged blues, Randy would become one of the key figures in neoclassical guitar. But if you're thinking about diminished arpeggios, harmonic minor patterns, and dueling guitar and harpsichord solos, you're not going to find them on Blizzard. Instead, what you will find is a beautifully composed 49-second acoustic guitar interlude called D, which, while no doubt classically inspired, was less the Paganini school of flashy virtuosity adopted by guitar heroes later in the decade, and more the understated Segovia interprets Bach style of mastery. As for the electrified songs on the album, they were from another era entirely, more specifically, the 70s. This was especially true of the album's production, which sounded much more like a classic rock record than an 80s metal record, with super dry drums and none of the big snares and lexicon reverbs that would soon dominate. You've got songs like No Bone Movies, don't ask, where the mid-focus guitar tones and the blues boogie riffing and the bouncy bass line wasn't really that far off from something like Boston's Smokin' or maybe even a Lynyrd Skynyrd tune. But there are magical moments when all these same sonic ingredients come together and point towards something truly futuristic. The foreboding classic Mr. Crowley was a sign of metal to come from its ominous Moog intro, double-tracked buzzsaw guitars, and a cutting vocal performance from Ozzy that all conspired to create a legitimately spooky vibe. And that mid-focus guitar tone had become almost an angry cello section, culminating in an improvised solo that was possibly one of Randy's most fiery recorded moments. As if the Eddie and Randy comparison was ever really a thing, it's here that the difference becomes really obvious, as Randy dives headlong into the aggressive, muted precision of fully picked attack, which was uncommon in rock guitar and striking to hear at the time, complete with wailing vibrato and a sinister closing dive bomb. These ingredients spilled over into the album's biggest hit, which you know, Crazy Train, whose opening riff juxtaposed that minor 6 and 7 degrees of the scale on top of the root, which really sells that natural minor feel. This was very much a rock guitar riff, but it was built on the kind of device you'd be more likely to hear in something like, let's say, Mozart's 40th Symphony, where you have the lead violin melody doing pretty much the same thing. Previously, to get this kind of harmony, you'd have to listen to complicated prog bands, or perhaps even classical music itself. But here, you were getting it in a mainstream rock package, something you and your mullet could crank up in your Camaro with the T-tops off. Not that I would know anything about that. All of this paved the way for even more overt explorations of both classical themes and guitar virtuosity in rock music, and this makes Blizzard an important transitional moment between styles and decades, a kind of promise, if you will, part of which was fulfilled the very next year with Blizzard's follow-up, Diary of a Madman, which presented immediately more modern recorded sonics and even more daring harmonic and songwriting sensibilities. But part of that promise would remain, sadly, forever unfulfilled with the untimely passing of Randy Rhoads, leaving us just these two inspiring examples of what heavy rock had been, what it would soon become, and just what kind of timeless magic can be created in the right hands.
So the group would be completed by Bob Daisley on bass, formerly of the band Rainbow, and Lee Kerslake on drums, better known for playing with Uriah Heep. There was additional help from Don Airey on keyboards, who of course had played with Black Sabbath. But before talking about the band, I think it's worth talking about the members, because it's very easy to think of Black Sabbath and where Ozzy would ultimately end up in his career and think of this as a heavy metal band. But I think it's fascinating when you really listen to the way these guys played, that there was nothing really all that metal about them. As Troy mentioned when talking about Randy Rhoads, there was something rock and roll about his playing. Of course, there were the darker and moodier moments on the album, like Mr. Crowley, but when you listen to a track like No Bone Movies, you know, there's slide guitar on that track. It's not a heavy metal track by any stretch of the imagination. Bob Daisley's bass playing was fantastically melodic. When you look at the way bass players tend to play in metal music, it's often about imitating the exact thing that the guitar player has played, but playing it, you know, an octave lower to thicken up the sound. But Bob wasn't about that. Bob was about playing melodies. He would play counter melodies. The guitar would be playing one thing, and he was quite happy to slide up the neck and add a melody over the top of it. And I thought that added a real kind of, as I say, rock and roll. It was 70s stuff more so than the way metal was going in the 80s. And lastly, Lee Kerslake on drums. I'm not a drummer, of course. I'm no expert on drums. But when I listen to Lee's playing, he doesn't have that what I would call metal drumming approach. It's not refined. It's not metronomically tight. And I believe he's just using the single kick pedal stuff on this album. So there's none of those rapid 16th note kick patterns that you would expect from, the later Metallica albums that would come. This was rock and roll at its finest. In fact, check out this absolutely killer fill from Crazy Train. I love this fill. It's got all of that metal attitude. It's like someone imitating a blast beat before blast beats were a thing. And I just want to add that while his contributions to the album were minimal, Don Airey's keyboard parts, they are criminally low in the mix. Of course, apart from that intro to Mr. Crowley, it's hard to hear when Don is actually playing anything. But when you check out the isolated keyboard parts, man, his playing on Mr. Crowley is absolutely incredible. I learnt this song when I was maybe 15 and had no idea of the wonderfully gothic keyboard parts that were buried in the mix underneath that verse section. Check it out. So recorded at Ridge Farm Studios in the UK, I think it's fair to say that the recording sessions could be summarised as follows. Ozzy Osbourne in the pub quite a lot, and mountains and mountains of cocaine enjoyed by everybody. I say everybody, it's often reported that Randy Rhoads was completely straight edge, but I have seen conflicting reports that he did partake from time to time. But we're not talking Ozzy Osbourne levels of consumption, we're talking maybe once a week a little bit of cocaine on his fingernail. In fact, I think everybody would agree, everybody involved would agree, that Randy was happy to send everybody away to the pub so he could spend hours working on his guitar solos, and it absolutely shows. So let's talk about some of the tracks on this album and get you inspired. Opening with the classic I Don't Know, that massive slide down the neck into that riff. This is a classic rock and roll track. And again, I keep saying rock and roll, right? But let's talk about the guitar tone, because this is an interesting tone. It's an album of production that is, or certainly has been criticised a lot over the years. It certainly isn't as polished as you would expect, especially for an album that would go on to be as big as this. There was definitely money involved in this album, but it sounds like the production is a little bit confused on how to get a tight guitar sound. It's reported that there were several microphones on the cabinet, with one going as far back as 16 feet to get some real ambience of the room. And you can hear that ambience. It's hard to describe. It's big but small at the same time. It's epic but boxy. So not crazy on the guitar tone, I have to be honest, but let's just briefly talk about the guitars that Randy was using on this record. I think it's relatively safe to say that he was just using two, though I could be wrong, there may have been a third guitar involved. But we absolutely know he would have been using his 1972 Gibson Les Paul Custom, I'm sure. Of course, the iconic white one. I say iconic, but is it as iconic as his polka dot Carl Sandoval Flying V? Probably not. It's easy to tell the difference between these two guitars on the record, of course, because the Les Paul doesn't have a tremolo and the Sandoval has that tremolo on there. So when you listen to a track like Crazy Train, tremolo, I don't own a tremolo, couldn't play that one myself. That's the Sandoval. Whereas when you hear a track like Crowley, I think that's probably the Les Paul. Certainly a track like No Bone Movies would be the Les Paul. But mentioning Crazy Train, why don't we talk about Crazy Train? In fact, why don't we have somebody else talk about Crazy Train? Mr. Jack Gardner.
So Randy Rhoads, I discovered him around about the time when I first picked up electric guitar, which would have been when I was 11 years old. I'll never forget, I bought a Total Guitar magazine. That was a UK-based magazine. I don't know whether it's still around these days. But they had a special on Randy Rhoads, and it was all about Crazy Train. They'd transcribed the whole song. And I remember at 11 hearing that for the first time, being like, oh my God, I've got to learn how he does that. That sounds ridiculous. I think this was at a time before, I'd really got into Yngwie, and I actually think Randy Rhoads was probably doing this around the same time that Yngwie was. I was reading that he was massively into classical guitar, and you can defo hear those kind of neoclassical type influences creeping in, especially in terms of song structures and stuff like that. He was obviously doing the tapping thing as well, in a little bit of a different way from Van Halen, I guess, and that later influenced the likes of, you know, the One solo, Metallica. But yeah, I mean, I remember being obsessed with this tune. It's everything you want as an 11-year-old kid. I remember being in a band practice in school, and we would literally just play the intro to this tune over and over again. It must have been countless amounts of dinner breaks, or, you know, after school rehearsal sessions, just playing this tune. Yeah, I mean, it was, I guess, an incorporation of all the different techniques that he was using that really attracted me at the time, especially as a young teenager. You know, technique is the big thing. Also vibrato. I remember I loved all of the kind of rock vibrato of that time, and Randy Rhoads was one of the guys doing that.
So, of course, yeah, Crazy Train was the single that put Ozzy back on the map. Epic leads, and that double track guitar, Jack made reference of that. When you really listen to these lead guitar parts, you can clearly hear that they're double tracked. In fact, the solo, the little lead guitar part that Randy plays in the first chorus area early on in the song, it's double tracked, but the guitars don't actually play the same thing, and it's actually the same in the guitar solo. The final run, there are two guitars that are playing two ever so slightly different things. Ever so slightly. It's like he's going to play the same thing, but he has an idea of what he's playing and he plays it, and there's a little bit of difference between those two things. I think that adds to the sound. It adds a level of chaos to things. You can't play these guitars single tracked and have them sound the way Randy made things sound back then. This is obviously something that many guitar players would go on to use in their own recordings to imitate that sound. Zakk Wylde, of course, does this a lot, especially on the early Black Label Society records. But while he was playing with Ozzy as well, there's certainly lots of double-tracked Zakk Wylde guitar parts. Though, of course, you can't mention Crazy Train without saying shame about that. Shame about the version from the Osbournes, right? Moving on, Goodbye to Romance. This is a really interesting song. I didn't like this song as a kid, but actually now listening to it, I have so much more appreciation for this. It's a song about saying goodbye. It's reported that it was about saying goodbye to Black Sabbath, an ode to his time with his former brothers. I don't really see that myself, and the reason I don't see that is because Bob Daisley wrote most of the lyrics on the album. I love the way that Ozzy will often retcon a song like that and tell you what it was about when he didn't write, you know, the song, sometimes writing a title or the odd word here or there. But yeah, Goodbye to Romance is certainly an interesting tune because, again, it's not metal by any stretch of the imagination. There are some rich seventh chords in the song, not what you would expect to hear on a heavy metal album. Some lovely vocal harmonies and a beautiful double-tracked guitar solo. Moving on, you have the Randy Rhoads solo piece, D. This is a short classical guitar piece. I actually played this. I played this in as a performance in school in front of my entire school. You know those tales. Certainly, many of you will remember sitting and listening to people play music in school assemblies, like end of year assembly type things. And you're you're sat and you're forced to listen to these 6 or 7 minute long pieces of classical music. Well, there was no problem with that with D. This took me a minute and a half, and I was done. I finished, and people didn't know whether they should clap or not because it can't be finished. It can't be finished so suddenly. But yeah, D is a very short piece of music, and I think it's easy to look at it on the album and say this piece doesn't really fit here. Why is Randy Rhoads being given this really, I don't want to say out of place, but it certainly takes you off guard. It's not what you would expect to be in the middle of an album like this. But I think there's some magic here. Of course, Randy wouldn't be with us for very long, and it's almost like whoever was deciding on what was going on the album thought, no, you know what, we need to include as much of this guy as possible. So I'm happy it's there. It's a relatively easy one to learn. So I think you should probably go and give that one a go. Randy was big into the classical guitar thing, and it was reported by many people that he was getting ready to leave Ozzy Osbourne's band so he could go and study classical guitar, which is absolutely noble, right? Moving on, the next track we have is, just double checking, Suicide Solution. Now, this is one of those Ozzy retcon things, right, where he talks about this song being about Bon Scott. It can't be, Bob Daisley wrote all the lyrics to it. So when Ozzy's talking about what he was thinking when he wrote the song, no. Bob Daisley has said many times that he wrote these lyrics talking about Ozzy Osbourne. And that one I can absolutely believe. This song would result in Ozzy ending up in court not for plagiarism or anything like that, but because unfortunately one of his fans killed themselves while listening to Suicide Solution. And of course, Take a Bottle, Drown Your Sorrows, all of these things, talking about getting a gun, etc. The parents did try and sue Ozzy for that and blame him for the death of their child. But of course, this is America. Well, this isn't America, but you're in America. And Ozzy was saved by that wonderful First Amendment to the Constitution, his right to free expression, free artistic expression. So yeah, while it is of course a shame, I don't think Ozzy has ever tried to encourage his fans to kill themselves, because that would be very bad for business. Let's move on to Mr. Crowley, one of the dark, epic songs on the album. It has a gothic flavour to it. I love this song. I absolutely love this song. In fact, I cut this little solo together of me playing the epic outro to the song, so check it out. Wonderful Aeolian harmony, you know, that epic build to that chorus, almost with like a full choir behind it as the guitar solo kicks in. Absolutely fantastic. And well, it's nowhere near as difficult as you would think. I remember that taking me weeks to learn as a child, and then when I thought about putting this video together, I was like, maybe I should learn that Mr. Crowley solo, and it only took me 10 minutes to get it to a standard that was perfectly playable. Anyway, onto the track No Bone Movies. This is an odd one, right? It's a great song, don't get me wrong, and me and my wife are often singing the lyrics to this song around the house because we like the song, really love the song. But it's definitely more rock and roll than heavy metal, right? And as I said earlier on in the video, it features a slide guitar solo. We often forget that Randy Rhoads recorded slide guitar. Randy would probably have been the first time I heard slide guitar, and I didn't even notice it until I was listening to the album again more recently. So yeah, cool song, just maybe a little bit out of place, especially when you consider the next song on the album is, you know, Chris Fina mentioned earlier that it's his favourite song on the album. It's my favourite song on the album too, Revelation Mother Earth. I wanted to record a video of me playing this, but there's so much depth on this song. There's so many layered guitars, but it's absolutely incredible the way this song builds and builds towards the final end. There's the riff that had repeated earlier in the song, and then suddenly you get that change in tempo and this heavy riff leading into a epically cool guitar solo with those ascending trills that Randy Rhoads played. Just absolutely amazing. I love that track so much, and it will always be a hugely important track to me. And then finally, of course, you have Steal Away with the Night. Again, I think this one is it's a little bit more rock and roll. It's certainly a little bit more rock and roll than it is heavy metal. It doesn't have that dark, foreboding quality that tracks like Mr. Crowley does. When you talk about the song Mr. Crowley, you're talking about lyrics about Aleister Crowley, the British occultist. It's a song that's about darkness. It's about people that talk about demons. It's looking into the dark side of society. And Steal Away with the Night just isn't. It sounds like a classic rock and roll song. And I love it. It's an absolutely fantastic song. Now, of course, it's documented that the band was supposed to be just that, a band, Blizzard of Oz, featuring Ozzy Osbourne. And actually, when you look at early singles like Crazy Train, it is apparent that this was a band, Blizzard of Oz. But when it came to releasing the album, it was always agreed that Ozzy's name would be on the cover, but it was supposed to be Blizzard of Oz, featuring Ozzy Osbourne. But what we got was Ozzy Osbourne, Blizzard of Oz. Crazy, right? Now, I see why they marketed things that way, but the band were led to believe that they were in a band rather than being the backing band for a bigger star. And I think this caused the most problems when it comes to this album, because Ozzy was in a rough state. I've often said that Ozzy is one of my all-time favourite recording artists. I love his music just about more than anyone else in the world. The old Desert Island Disc thing, if I was locked away on a desert island and I could only take one artist with me, I'm probably going for Ozzy Osbourne. He is one of my favourite artists of all time, but I don't think that he's musically talented in the slightest. I think that he has a very unique voice, and I think he has a consistent ability to surround himself with wonderfully talented musicians that can, milk what Ozzy is capable of. Unless you listen to Ordinary Man, where in that case, he's lost his touch along last. So working with Randy and Bob and Lee, I absolutely believe that these guys were writing 90+% of the music to create a band. But when it came to royalties, things didn't really go that way. It was expected that Ozzy was taking majority credit for all of this stuff. And I know that this caused tensions amongst the band, most notably between bass player Bob Daisley, and drummer Lee Kerslake. They wanted their fair share. They wanted the credit that they deserved. And that's absolutely understandable. Ultimately, these guys would end up being fired from the band, just before the release, after the recordings of Diary of a Madman, the follow-up album. And outrageously, they weren't even credited on the album as being the performers that played it. When I was growing up, I was under the impression that Tommy Aldrich and Rudy Sarzo played bass and drums on this album, but they didn't. Those guys were just credited to wipe away Daisley and Kerslake's contribution to the album. And that's, abhorrent behaviour, absolutely abhorrent behaviour. And it's easy when you're talking about Ozzy Osbourne to blame Sharon for everything, because she is the one in control. She's the manager and she's the business head. Ozzy's the party animal. It's hard to imagine Ozzy Osbourne ever being cutthroat. I'm sure when he has a drink that maybe he can be a bit of an asshole, but I can't imagine him being cutthroat. Maybe that's me just always giving someone I love the benefit of the doubt. But, this should paint the picture. Ultimately, Bob Daisley and Lee Kerslake would sue for their rights. And Ozzy and Sharon were not happy about this. There's actually a re-release, an anniversary re-release of the first two Ozzy Osbourne albums, the 2002 ones. Warning, do not listen to these versions of the albums. Do not support this behaviour, where they actually replaced Lee Kerslake and Bob Daisley. They had Ozzy's drummer and bass player at the time, who of course was Mike Bordin on drums, and Robert Trujillo, Metallica's bass player, on bass. They actually went in and re-recorded all of those parts just to make sure, out of supreme levels of pettiness, just to make sure that Lee Kerslake and Bob Daisley wouldn't get any money for the songs that they wrote. Just think about the level of pettiness that is involved in doing something like that. It doesn't matter to me if it was Sharon or if it was Ozzy. Just think about that. Ozzy Osbourne is completely down and out, absolutely no prospects, isn't going anywhere in his life, and what he needs is to surround himself with talented musicians who can pick him up off the ground and relaunch his career. And let's be fair, they did relaunch his career. And your way of rewarding people like that is to remove them because they want their fair share. Remove them because they want what was theirs. To shit on all of the fans that grew up listening to those albums and just think that it would be completely acceptable to replace integral members of the band with modern day players. Absolutely astonishing. And I say don't listen to those versions of the albums. Those albums have been restored. They are now in their original full glory, and evidently a lot of that pettiness has been dropped. So yeah, that one's absolutely crazy. Absolutely crazy. And that's really all that there is to say about this particular album, other than where it sits in terms of legacy. As you know, Ozzy went on to record many, many more albums. You, of course, have Diary of a Madman, and then when Randy Rhoads passed away, Jake E. Lee would join the band and they would record Bark at the Moon. And then while Ozzy was locked away in the Betty Ford, Jake would write The Ultimate Sin, the album that was recorded and released, and for a long time Ozzy didn't consider it an Ozzy album. Zakk Wylde would join the band, No Rest for the Wicked, No More Tears. There are tons of great albums. Osmosis, still a great album. Down to Earth, I do actually enjoy Down to Earth. Black Rain, this is where things start to drop off a little bit for me. Scream with Gus G on guitar, I actually do think that album's pretty damn good. I think there's some great moments on that album. And then of course the latest one, Ordinary Man. Just don't do it to yourself. Ozzy has had a wonderfully huge career. And when you look back at that time, Ozzy has been open about the fact that when it came to releasing Blizzard of Oz, he absolutely felt that he was in competition with Black Sabbath. Everyone was seeing what he was going to do versus this huge band that he was in. And that was a lot of pressure on him. Well, ultimately, he had absolutely nothing to worry about. Blizzard of Oz would go on to be certified 5 times platinum. 5 times platinum. And when you compare that to Black Sabbath, their most successful album still to this day is Paranoid, which was released in 1970. Yeah, 1970. And that's only been certified 4 times platinum. So although that is a hugely popular album, you know, Blizzard of Oz is more successful than anything Black Sabbath ever recorded. It's an absolute stormer of an album, and I urge you to please go and listen to it today. Absolutely wonderful, and I'm sure you will have a great time with it. And there we have it, guys. Rock School, Metal School, however you want to think of it, finished. What did you think? Did you enjoy it? Please do let me know in that comment section below. I would look forward to doing more of these. As usual, I just want to say a huge thank you to my supporters over on Patreon. This has been the first time I have really taken a lot of time to work on a video, like really write a video, reach out to people and plan. This, unlike previous videos that I've done where I hit on a camera and I just talk, this one there was more scripting involved. I worked on backing tracks and things like that, obviously sending backing tracks to Jack Gardner to get that wonderful rendition of Crazy Train. I did my version of Mr. Crowley. Time and effort went into this, and I wouldn't have been able to take time out of all of the transcription work without your support. So thank you so much. You guys are absolutely awesome, and I love you all very dearly. And yeah, if you have enjoyed this video, please do check me out on Patreon by clicking this button up here. You can subscribe by clicking this button down here. You can actually even join me as a YouTube VIP now by clicking the join button, which is underneath this video down here. Get transcriptions and all that stuff. And lastly, 2 more of my videos here and here. I say my videos, you know what? Screw it. Let's make them Ozzy Osbourne videos, because he is this. None of this would be here without him. So much love to you, Ozzy. Much love to you guys watching my videos. Thank you so much for all of the support, guys. And I will see you for another video soon. Go and enjoy that album now.